Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Firat Demir from University of Oklahoma Center for Peace and Development and the Department of Economics, as well as the Security in Context Network. Our distinguished guest today is Professor Yeşim Arat, who was a member of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the prestigious Bogazici University in Istanbul, from where she recently retired. She is also a member of the Science Academy of Turkey. Professor Arat works on questions of women's political participation, gender-based violence, and problems of democratization in Turkey. She is the author of 4 books, including The Patriarchal Paradox, Women Politicians in Turkey, Rethinking Islam and Liberal Democracy, Islamist Women in Turkish Politics, Violence Against Women in Turkey, and her last book, Turkey Between Democracy and Authoritarianism. Now, the title of Professor Arat's talk today is The Women's Movement and the Challenge of Political Islam in Turkey, which is her specialty, as I mentioned earlier. But before we start the lecture, I'd like to share our heartfelt condolences for people in Turkey and Syria who lost so much from this week's earthquake that claimed thousands of lives, and many are continuing to suffer from struggling to survive under the rubbles and winter conditions. So, before further ado, Professor Arat, welcome to University of Oklahoma, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hey, I would like to thank Professor Demir very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be with you today. Yes, as he said, we are going through a tragedy these days, and I did feel a bit awkward talking this today on the subject that I was going to talk about, but then I thought over to myself, and I think, there are so many commonalities. What I'm going to talk about is also about so much of it is about rights and the claim to rights to life, and what we're going through right now is all about solidarity, very much what women's movement is all about. So I thought, I would take these themes of solidarity and rights and claim to life and faith in getting those rights implemented to my talk. So I will move to my talk and go through these issues more systematically. Okay, in this talk, I would like to examine the women's movement in Turkey and its response to the conservative policies of the Islamically rooted AK Party in power since 2002. During the past 4 decades, feminist activism changed shape in various ways, and tonight or this morning for you, I would like to draw attention to how feminists that demanded rights and successively secured many from 1980s to 2010s had to be on the defensive and act to protect those rights from patriarchal encroachment thereafter. Yet, even though the Islamically rooted governments impaired feminist goals of extending their rights, the women's movement gained ground, expanded its scope, and became a focal point of opposition to the incumbent party. While the governments in power challenged the women's movement, the movement kept growing. I shall first discuss the project of modernity in Turkey that took place after the foundation of the Republic in 1923 and through which women's rights expanded. Then I shall discuss the emergence of the women's movement and the different stages since 1980s, with a particular emphasis on the impact of the pro-Islamic AK Party, or Justice and Development Party in English. Women's rights and the project of modernity in Turkey. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his comrades that founded the new Turkish state in 1923 initiated a project of modernity to westernize Turkey. The most crucial aspect of this modernization was secularization of state and society in the country. The founding fathers of the Turkish Republic had inherited a religious state and society with a strong tradition of secular rule from the Ottoman Empire. The secular tradition took a radical turn with the foundation of the Republic. The Republic declared sovereignty to belong to the nation and took radical steps to privatize religion and secularize the state. It disestablished Islam, its institutions, the caliphate, its representatives, laws, education, sources of finance, symbols, and restricted its public visibility and dissemination. The new regime was less interested in securing religious freedoms than in controlling the role of a religion in society, so that religious ways of life would not prevent the country from catching up with the West. Privately, Turkey was still a 90% Muslim country at the time, at the foundation, and mosques were around, and you could practice Islam. It's just that they wanted to separate religion and politics. The process of secularization precipitated women's emancipation during the 1920s and 30s. Prior to the foundation of the Republic, Islam, as practiced and endorsed by the Ottomans, segregated women in the public realm, encouraged domestic roles for women, and maintained male-female complementarity, mostly, I'm generalizing now, rather than equality in the personal codes. In 1926, the founding fathers replaced the religious civil code with a secular one fashioned along the Swiss civil code of the time. And the new code prohibited polygamy, subjected marriage to secular law, outlawed unilateral divorce, recognized male-female equality in inheritance, and the equal guardianship of children. The process was singular among Muslim majority countries at the time, and frankly, even to date. In 1934, the new state recognized women's suffrage, thus expanding public roles women could assume in the secular republic. Mustafa Kemal personally and his governing elites, along with him, encouraged women to be educated and play important roles in the public realm. Secularization process did result in the extension of women's education and their presence in the public realm. Women, especially among the middle class in larger cities, mostly endorsed the reforms eagerly. Many of them thus played important roles as professionals in building the secular culture of contemporary Turkey. By 1970s about 30% of Turkish lawyers, doctors, and even more of teachers were women. At the time, these figures compared very favorably, not only with the rest of Middle East, but also Europe and the United States. Meanwhile, the project of modernity that emancipated women in Turkey was accompanied with an official discourse which prided itself with these reforms and the transformation of women's public standing, but at the same time assumed that the subject of women's rights was one that was resolved. This myth was perpetuated by professional women themselves as well. They had indeed been indebted to the reforms to attain the positions that they had in the society, after all. Another important development was that as the process of secularization succeeded to develop and modernize the country, the need to democratize precipitated the need to lax the secular hold of the state over religion. Process of democratization that accompanied Westernization brought concessions to the more religious groups and expansion of religion's hold over society, if not the retrenchment of the secular lifestyle over the years. In 1950, Turkey moved away from a single party to a multi-party regime, and over the years, religious groups organized throughout the social and political realm and established strong parties rooted in Islam. Emergence of the feminist and the women's movement was also a product of Turkey's political development. Yet the movement emerged in Turkey in the aftermath aftermath of the 1980 military coup that disrupted the democratic rule, deposed civilian government, crushed the radical left and the radical right to a certain extent. In an attempt to depoliticize the society, the military passed a new constitution which restricted liberal rights, increased state surveillance over civil society, and increased the power of the executive in relation to the legislature. Despite this new restrictive legal framework and new restructuring, forces of globalization permeated through the borders of the nation state. The United Nations had declared the decade of 1975-85 as the decade for women. In 1985, Turkey signed the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Treaty. In 1987, she applied to the European Union for membership, recognized the right of individual complaint to the European Commission of Human Rights. Shortly after, it signed the Paris Charter for New Europe and the Helsinki Summit Declaration on Human Rights. In 1999, Turkey became a candidate country to the European Union and formally began the negotiations for membership in 2005. Daughters of the first generation of women who had benefited from the fruits of the project of modernization in Turkey were inspired in this new context of globalization and increasing consciousness of human rights by second wave feminism in the West. Even though women's status had improved since the Ottoman times, many indicators reveal that women remained second-class citizens. The literacy rate that was about 10% in 1935 had improved, yet almost half the women were illiterate in the late 1970s. While Turkey prided itself with her professional women, there were gender discrepancies both in secondary and higher education, exacerbated by urban-rural differences. In 1980, 36% of the economically active population was female. However, about 88% of this group worked in agricultural sector as unpaid family laborers. The proportion of women in parliament had not risen beyond the 4.5% level, which was the same as when Mustafa Kemal had appointed 18 women to parliament back in 1935. Almost half the women were housewives. The Republic had encouraged women's emancipation, had also encouraged them to assume traditional roles within the family. Most importantly, domestic violence was a burning issue which was confined to the private realm. The pioneering feminists began organizing and articulating their demands as women in this depoliticized post-society, and perhaps they were not seen as a challenge to political rule, or the legacy of the Kemalist reforms concerning women gave them some kind of an immunity in the eyes of especially the military leadership of the time, from being silenced. But they were allowed to come out, and they were the first political group to raise their voice in the early 1980s. While there were many cleavages among them, including along Marxist, socialist, leftist, Kemalist lines, feminists of different persuasions prioritized the problem of domestic violence in Turkey, a taboo not discussed in the public domain until then, and one that required immediate attention. Besides domestic violence, a second priority was amendment of legal codes, which had been progressive in their time, but did not meet the demands of the times. That was also an important goal, and both of which the feminist activists pursued very effectively. The 1980s were mostly defined by successful feminist campaigns. In 1985, feminists petitioned to have the CEDAW Treaty, which Turkey had signed in 85, implemented. In 87, the feminists took to streets to condemn domestic violence, which at the time was an unprecedented incident. Nobody had heard of domestic violence publicly voiced, let alone protested by women in public. Various other very colorful campaigns followed. And over time, feminists gained the confidence and acquired the skills to institutionalize their activities. And in 1990s, they established a foundation to open a women's shelter. Again, nobody had heard of women's shelter. Established a women's library. Founded an association to promote women politicians. The projects undertaken in the western parts of the country generated a synergy with which a group of women in less developed parts of the country, in southern eastern Kurdish majority city, for example, of Diyarbakir, they founded Kamer, another foundation to fight gender-based violence. Over time, women's organizations multiplied. It was something like 10 in 1980, became 350 in 1990s. Feminist journals, artists, academicians all began to have a voice and became part of the movement. Under pressure from local women's groups and criticisms levied against the state, especially internationally, in UN women's conferences, for example, that state officials, ministers had to attend, state and political parties began responding to feminist calls. In 1990, a Ministry of Women and Family was established. In 1998, the Minister of State responsible for Women and Family initiated the law for the protection of the family to protect battered women. The law, which would be strengthened after Istanbul Convention, allowed the court, even at the time, to protect the spouse exposed to domestic violence by giving the public prosecutor the right to file a suit against the guilty partner and keep him or her away. Similarly, the Civil Code was amended in 2001 after a long period of successful coalition building going back to the 80s and women's relentless pursuit of this goal, lobbying, different campaigns, feminist bureaucrats' interventions. The code had various articles that discriminated against women. The husband was recognized as the head of the family. The wife was recognized as his helper only. The husband was expected to earn the family income, choose the family residence, and represent the marriage union. The separate ownership of property regime that was used at the time did not recognize women's labor at home. The new code did not only repeal the discriminatory articles, it also recognized women's labor at home by introducing a joint ownership of the property regime. This property, property acquired during marriage would be shared in cases of divorce. Divorced women or those who wanted to divorce could now fall back on the labor they spent to maintain their married lives. In a country where most women were housewives, recognition of women's domestic work was crucial for their long-term economic security. Similarly, the Penal Code amendment of 2004 was another significant achievement, result of a coalition of women working on this project. The old code recognized sexual crimes committed against individual women as crimes against public morality. The new code accepted women as individuals who have rights that sexual crimes violate. Crimes related to sexual violence were redefined as crimes against individuals rather than crimes against public morality. Sexual crimes began to be punished with heavier sentences. The new code criminalized sexual harassment as well as sexual attacks and rape. It increased penalties for domestic violence and other crimes. Marital rape, harassment at workplace, neither of which was considered an offense before the amendment, were recognized as crimes. Kurdish and feminist women and Kurdish and Islamist feminists were also important constituent of the women's movement in the country. Kurdish feminists collaborated with Turkish feminists on many issues, especially on issues of gender-based violence and the amendment of the existing codes. They also sought to be recognized with their Kurdish identity and their Kurdish predicament, where the Turkish state discriminated against them as Kurds as well as women. They were politicized as Kurdish feminists in the context of a nationalist movement fighting against ethnic discrimination. Kurdish women also protested as mothers in search of their lost relatives, namely Saturday mothers or peace mothers, whose sons had died in the war against the state and who are now seeking reconciliation with the state. Another large group of women who sought to extend their rights were the pious women who claimed their right to use religiously prescribed, as they were taught to believe, headscarves. Primarily attending universities and in public voice. They sought their rights, protesting in front of university gates, in courts, writing Islamist journals, establishing different associations in pursuit of their rights, which they were able to get about a decade after the religiously rooted AKP came to power in 2013. A decade after they came to power in 2013. In short, the women's movement that emerged in the early 1980s and flourished through the participation of different groups was important as a democratizing force in the country. Women who voiced demands for rights in the political arena destabilized the hegemonic Kemalist discourse on issues of women's rights, secularism, and nationalism as defined through the project of modernity in the country. Women who arguably had benefited most from the Kemalist reforms criticized these reforms from these different angles. The secular feminist criticized the authoritarian Republican patriarchy. Kurdish women, its nationalist patriarchy, as well as the Republican patriarchy. And Islamist women, primarily its secularist patriarchy. These women propagated a consciousness for broader rights and liberties, a necessary, if not condition, of democracy, as they actively participated in politics to extend their rights. The relationship of the women's movement to the state gradually changed during the AK Party period. The different groups within the women's movement criticized the Kemalist reforms to make the state more liberal and progressive, and they got some results. During the AK Party rule, the feminists who made up the core of the women's movement began to be seen as a threat to the ideology, culture, and values of the Islamically rooted party, which controlled the state, while Islamist women's voices were heard on the headscarf issue, if not on other issues, if not always on other issues. The predecessors of the AK Party, three of them, the three other parties before AK Party, had been closed down by the Constitutional Court because these parties allegedly engaged in activities that violated constitutional article protected the secular nature of the republic. By the time AK Party came to power in 2002, the party had reconciled itself to secularism and the republic's westward-looking modernization. At the time, the prospect of joining the EU, if Turkey did modernize, seemed plausible. The AK Party came to power promising to undertake these reforms necessary for democratization and assuming it would also benefit from this democratization to extend religious rights. The state elites of the country, including the president, the judiciary, and the military, were at the time still occupied by staunch secularists who were deeply skeptical of Islamist rooted politicians in power. The AK Party had to prove its legitimacy and that it would abide by secular laws of the constitution. Under these circumstances, the AK Party did take a pro-feminist stance when it first came to power. The parliament passed the penal code amendment I mentioned before. During this period, in 2006, the prime minister collaborated with feminist groups to issue a radical memorandum to prevent gender-based violence, where all the actions and policies that every state institution that would have to take action was spelled out. The government reinforced gender equality article of the Constitution, Article 10, by adding that the state would be responsible for establishing gender equality. But these measures were never put into effect. They helped the AK Party gain some legitimacy, particularly at the international level. Gender-based reforms signaled that this religiously rooted party was progressive on human rights and endorsed universal values. It could be a credible partner that deserved financial and political support. However, as AK Party became more secure, it changed the rules of the democratic contestation, such that the political system turned into a competitive authoritarian and gradually an authoritarian one. As the party became more powerful, the traditional values of the party members began to dominate their politics. In 2010, the government called a referendum to change the recruitment rules for the members of the Constitutional Court and the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors. The aim was to increase the AK Party's power over the judiciary. The number of judges sitting on the high courts would increase, and so AKP would be able to bring its allies into office more easily, and lower level judges who were more friendly to AK Party and the popularly elected AK Party majority in the parliament would be able to choose some of the members of the high courts as well. So there would be more AK Party allies in the high courts. Before the courts themselves, the Court of Cassation and the Council of State themselves basically determined who the members of these courts would be. So it was very meritocratic. So this proposal was seemingly democratic. However, right after the referendum, which was accepted by 58% of the popular vote, AK Party immediately placed its allies into these courts to outnumber the sitting judges and began politicizing the courts in its favor. After the 2010 referendum, a final seemingly liberal move in line with the goals of the feminist women's movement was the contribution of Turkey to the drafting of the 2011 Council of Europe Convention on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence, named the Istanbul Convention for short, because it was opened for signature in Istanbul. A Turkish feminist professor who had chaired the CEDAW committee for 2 terms contributed to the drafting of the convention. Turkey was the first country to ratify the convention in its parliament. A year later, in 2012, the parliament passed a new law that strengthened the 1998 law on the prevention of domestic violence. Women's protection against violence was a pragmatic cause that both the secular and religious groups inside the country, as well as the international community, would approve. The AK Party would thus try and mask its increasing illiberalism and religious turn. After the 2000 referendum, on various public occasions and with total disregard for the male-female equality protected by the Constitution, the leader of the AKP and at the time the Prime Minister Tayyip Erdoğan explicitly said that he did not believe in equality between man and woman, and that it was against their nature. Consistent with his belief that women's primary responsibility, should be to bear and rear kids, he encouraged all women to have 3 kids. And in a 2012 UN Population Fund conference Turkey hosted, he stated he was against abortions. In 2013, he announced that he didn't want male-female students sharing flats or dorms, and he would personally pursue this issue, which he claimed was not aligned with traditions. He wanted to cultivate a pious youth in line with his religiously legitimized gender norms. And party members and ministers followed suit, supported him. Various occasions there were these discriminatory remarks. And one of them announcing that modernity was the appropriate career for women, another stating a virtuous woman should not laugh in public, should not wear lipstick, another sharing his view that pregnant women should not make themselves visible. But besides these proclamations, contrary to the international conventions Turkey had signed, AK Party government abolished the Ministry of State responsible for women and family to replace it with Ministry of Family and Social Policies. Thus, feminists lost their influence over an important state institution that had help them push for progressive legislation and gender rights. The new ministry prioritized keeping women within the family and promoting family values. It set up a divorce process counseling service to mediate between partners to save marriages from breaking up. Although Turkey had one of the lower divorce rates in Europe, divorce commissions were formed in the parliament to make divorce more difficult and provide reconciliation to save marriages. For many feminists and women, these initiatives reflected the disrespect for individual women's decisions and would result in keeping women within abusive marriages. And meanwhile, marriages and families continued to be sites of violence for women. Between 2010 and 15, at least 1,134 women were murdered in Turkey by their male relatives, and more than half of the culprits were husbands. At least 35% of all women in Turkey say that they experienced physical violence from their husbands at least once during their adult lives. I mean, there was more systematic promotion of traditional roles, but I think I should begin wrapping up. The Directorate of Religious Affairs encouraged traditional roles for women, Friday sermons in mosques, Quranic courses, helping them disseminate these religious norms, religious roles prescribed for women. Infiltrating into secular education through different ways, prayer leader preacher schools increasing in numbers, religious education given at these schools, encouraging these traditional roles in Turkey. In 2015, the Constitutional Court, which by then had a very pro-government membership, issued a verdict that would encourage religious marriages and challenge the supremacy of the secular civil code over marriages. Until then, religious marriages could be contracted only after a civil marriage. Contracting a religious marriage without a civil marriage and officiating at such a ceremony were both punishable offenses. Court's 2015 decision granted the right to contract religious marriages without a civil marriage. By encouraging the enactment of religious marriages, the decision effectively would deprive women of the protection of the civil code on issues such as inheritance, divorce, child custody, alimony, if they remained only religiously married. The civil marriage was arguably the most important achievement of the Republican reforms for women and one of the most important successes of feminists who had worked for 2 decades to have it amended. The new verdict threatened to hollow it out. It expanded religious sphere, encouraged religiously prescribed traditional roles for women, if not the religiously prescribed rules regarding marriage, such as polygamy or unilateral divorce. And later 1 year later, the parliament passed a law to allow religious personnel to perform civil marriages. According to the constitution, marriages would have to take place before secular civil authorities. As such, the new law is very much against the present constitution and challenges the secular spirit of the civil marriage. Religious personnel are trained to respect religious law, and it is not clear whether they believe in the importance of civil marriage and observing its civil rules. For example, the minimum age requirements, which religious law doesn't require. Finally, in March 2021, President Erdogan, by this time president, of course, after 2018, president, withdrew Turkey from the convention primarily to accommodate the demands of the radicals within his conservative party. In 2019, 474 women, and in 2020, 300 women were murdered by a close relative, mostly husbands or ex-husbands. In this context, the convention was and is an important source of legitimacy and a means to reinforce women's call to stop violence against women. Women's movement did respond. In 2013, the AK Party had lifted the ban on Muslim headscarves by amending the existing dress code. So the pious women accomplished their goals, and the cause of their protest was gone. Yet the secular women, whether or not they call themselves feminists, have been vigilant about and responsive to the assaults to their lifestyles and values coming from the ruling elites through different channels. In response, their activism transformed from one of demanding expansion of rights to that of resistance to encroachment of rights. By 2010, first, they had gained the experience, the organizational skills, including using the internet and organizing effectively through the internet to resist against these encroachments. Secondly, they collaborated much more extensively, not only with one another, but also the broader opposition to political rule, to defend their rights, even when they were not always victorious. When the government attempted to curtail abortion rights in 2014, women collaborated with numerous secular groups, including, for example, the Turkish Medical Association, Bar Association, mobilized thousands of women, both locally and throughout the country, not only in Istanbul, Mersin, Sinop, Diyarbakır, Van, and internationally, to prevent a retraction of their abortion rights. They networked with the European Women's Lobby, which posted a solidarity statement in support of the protesting women. Perhaps more significantly, pious women columnists writing in government-supported newspapers supported secular women on the abortion issue, even when they argued that they were personally opposed to abortion. Despite the polarization between Islamists and secularists, just as there were feminists who had supported the pious women in their fight for their Islamic headscarves, the pious women supported the secular women on the abortion issue. The government did not pursue its intent to restrict abortion. Similarly, in 2016, secular women collaborated with pious women and prevented the AK Party government from changing the penal code to allow men who had sex with underage children, including rape, to have their punishment deferred if they married those children. Feminists reached out to the government sponsored women's organization, Kadem, whose vice president was the daughter of the president, to collaborate with them. The bill again was eventually dropped. Feminists despite these successes, feminists increasingly find it harder to get what they want. They were not able to prevent the 2015 Constitutional Court decision, which allowed religious marriages to be contracted without a prior civil marriage, or the religious personnel to contract civil marriages. Similarly, they could not, most recently, they could not reverse the decision of the president to opt out of the Istanbul Convention. The government-supported organization, Kadem, that defended complementary roles for women and men, very different than the feminists, was publicly opposed to the prospect of getting out of Istanbul Convention at the cost of tolerating a smear campaign against its organization, and even the president's daughter got her share of this smear campaign. However, the women's movement proved to be a most active leader of opposition to the regime in the country, in its resistance to the decision to exit from Istanbul Convention. Leaders of the feminist organizations carried the presidential decision to the Council of State, the highest administrative court in the country, where the prosecutor also stated that the president's decree was not lawful. The parliament had signed the convention, and only the parliament could decide to exit or not. While justice was not delivered, women's resistance to the presidential decree and determination to contest it within the legal system as well as in the streets energized the opposition. Political parties in the opposition united behind the women's movement in protest of this exit. Leaders of the largest opposition party, CHP, the Nationalist Splinter Party, İYİ Party, national splinter from National Action Party, and the splinter parties from AK Party, the two splinter parties, Deva, Gelecek, all supported women defending the convention. They promised to repeal the decision, individually promised to repeal the decision on the Istanbul Convention as the first thing they will do if they come to power in May 2023 general elections. The CHP established an Istanbul Convention Solidarity Network. Heads of CHP women's branches from all the 81 provinces in the country filed lawsuit against the decision as well. İYİ Party and Deva Party individually initiated their own lawsuits against the decision. And when the Council of State heard their case, hundreds of women lawyers, close to 800, from all over the country, as well as representatives of political parties, filled the courtroom, turning the hearing into a historic occasion. Never before had any court case seen such a crowd. Women's in the Court of Council of State. Women's movement, with its heterogeneous population, united and spearheaded the opposition behind one of its goals. The women's movement had cultivated the power to make the political opposition endorse its claims and magnify its voice. The range of women's organizations, platforms, and activism had increased by 2023. It included groups who work on all aspects of women's issues, problems, and interests, including environmental rights, women's environmental rights, sexual issues, those working on stopping daily femicides in the country. Feminists who initiated the women's movement by criticizing the illiberal aspects of Kemalist modernization are now the most active and resourceful defenders of the goals of modernization, otherwise, that the founding fathers of the regime had. Power takes different forms. Leading the opposition does require power, one that women's movement now has, but did not have 2 decades earlier. However, there is still much to be done that requires collaboration with the state. And according to the latest Global Gender Gap Index issued by World Economic Forum, Turkey is 124th among the 146 countries ranked, and the state has to get and implement the policies women defend, and there is need for further collaboration. I think I'll just stop here. I think I'm over time a bit, and we'll be able to take some questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we already have some questions, and please use the Q&A for any other questions you have. One question that came from the platform, but I also have a similar one. If you look at the cleavages or the different goals and motivations of the women's organizations in Turkey, particularly religious versus non-religious groups, two issues that seem to stand up, especially in juxtaposition to other individual freedoms. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, as you mentioned, the religious groups on the women's movement flagship, the headscarf or the freedom to dress according to their religious beliefs as one of the fundamental individual rights and freedoms. And if you look at the recent protests in Iran last year, for women coming from very similar backgrounds, this time protesting not to be forced to wear headscarf, there seems to be a silence or different perspectives in the case of Turkish women's movement from the Islamist side. How do you explain at the least neutral or at worst negative attitudes that was portrayed on the news and several press releases and so on, with this juxtaposed behavior? On the one hand, supporting individual freedoms to wear headscarf in Turkey, but opposing women's rights not to wear headscarf in a neighboring country, Iran. A similar question could be related to child marriage issues, but I'll take you on the Iran versus Turkey first.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, women are socialized differently, and I think, we should try to understand all these women that have these different beliefs and norms. I mean, they have, that's, I mean, you know, it's not, obviously I would prefer, you know, headscarf women, Islamist women to be sporting women's right not to wear the headscarves, or to voice or to have their voices heard more forcefully. But I've always seen, you know, more, you know, women who have been influenced by one another on both groups. And I think this hybridity is the interesting part. There are still some women who are very much on the side of women, as they were in the abortion issue, which was even a more difficult issue. I mean, on the abortion issue in Turkey, not in Iran, but in Turkey, I mean, you know, some religious women did come out. They were opinion leaders in Turkey. So, you know, they haven't expressed, they haven't come out, voice their support, perhaps for the Iranian women. But I mean, I think, you know, they are also under, you know, under patriarchal control of their, you know, of their own particular social circles too. So, I mean, I think that can explain. But I think, you know, there are these interesting influences. I mean, these borders between these groups are never, never sealed completely. There are always some perforations. You know, light breaks through the small holes in the walls, and you know, it's like that. And you know, you have women who were not as vocal on violence issues either. I mean, you know, in the 1990s, many Islamist women were mostly concerned about the headscarf. But, you know, after AK Party came to power and began, some women, you know, pious women began writing in pro-AK Party dailies, these women began supporting feminists on the gender-based violence issues, but you know, it's I mean, patriarchal strains are, you know, stronger perhaps amongst their groups. You know, that might be some reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question is, it came from Ursula Armstrong. I'm reading it. Since Turkey's revocation of the Istanbul Convention, what kind of support now exists in Turkey for victims of violence against women? To what extent are women able to liberate themselves from violent relationships? Are supporting networks still able to operate freely, or have they been forced to go underground?
No, I don't think, you know, that is the case right now. But you know, the supporting networks were never very large, very, very powerful, not of the state. And, you know, so that's why, you know, civil society groups were coming. I mean, Kamer, for example, or Morçatı, civil society groups that feminists established. They're still active, and they're still helping out. Kamer in the Eastern Anatolian region, in all the 23 provinces of Turkey, they are organized, and Morçatı also. And you know, you have still state institutions trying to help out, but it's just that it's not enough. You know, we were talking about 35% of women saying that, you know, they have been they've experienced physical violence from their husbands at least once in their adult time. And this becomes, I mean, worse for women who earn more than their husbands, for example. I mean, we had Ayşe Gül Altınay and I carried out a gender-based violence survey in 2007, and I mean, less education, you get more violence, and it's there's somebody, I mean, it's, who dies every day, every other day. It's not enough. It should be much more seriously. These laws need to be much more seriously implemented. They haven't gone underground, but they're not implemented properly. I mean, the Istanbul Convention was very, extensive, and it elaborated everything that needed to be done, the kind of socialization, education, all these institutional health issues. And in Turkey, in 2006, the presidential decree that was signed, I mean, at the time, Prime Minister Erdogan issued it when he was trying to impress the secularists. And he worked with the same feminist women, not the Islamist women. Not the Islamist feminists, not the secular feminist groups. And if they implemented that 2006 program, there'd be a lot of improvement. But laws are there, and similar with the with what happened in the catastrophe we're going through now, earthquakes. I mean, we knew what was wrong. I mean, all the professors were telling us that there would be this particular earthquake, and laws weren't implemented, and they allowed these buildings that weren't strong to be used. And so these laws are there, but people, I mean, the governments are not implementing them. That's
great. Thank you. A couple more questions. One that I'm curious in terms of the if you look at the women's movement in the last 30 years in Turkey, do you see more cooperation around issues? In the past, as you mentioned, there were women's movements as a plural, from Kurdish women's to religious to secular to Kemalist. Even within secular could be divided probably, and further, further left and so on. Do you see more cooperation and alignment of interests going forward, or same contested spaces around issues, say nationality or religion or other identities becoming more obstacle?
I think there is more cooperation going amongst them. I think, AKP united the women as well when there was such an assault on encroachment of their rights. Women did unite, I mean, more. Before, with secular governments, there was more room for contestation amongst themselves too. And even as I said, even the Islamist women who were basically, like Kadem, it's a gongo. It's government organized. Basically, it was organized after the famous 2010 referendum I talked about, when AKP became more powerful and this competitive authoritarianism began. And even Kadem, the Gongo Kadem, was against the exit from Istanbul Convention. I mean, their lawyers were coming out, writing in their websites, look, the convention doesn't say anything against, it won't break up the family. It's not promoting LGBTIQ people. But so they were on the side of the feminists, and they had been, they hadn't come out in the 1990s when women were trying to push and did manage to succeed. The 1998 law to prevent gender-based violence, which was the first important law that was passed. Is my answer.
Thank you. And I think one last question from the floor. I'm not sure exactly. It's from Baljit's side. Is there a cultural implication of domestic violence rather than a national statistic? have you seen differences in data from countries around vis-a-vis domestic violence? Think he's referring. Yeah, go ahead.
I think domestic violence is a universal problem. And I think Turkey might be on the among those who have higher rates. 35 is pretty high on domestic violence. It's usually 1/5 to 1/4 that do say they have been exposed to some kind of physical violence. But in our research, for example, we didn't find the variations between the East and the West that much in domestic violence. At least it wasn't as strong or as large as was claimed. There were other variables at work that could explain, like education or especially education, the variation. So it's not like this part of the country is culturally more exposed to violence that the other part is not. You have violence in very educated groups too, and they're more resistant. They don't articulate it as much, or know how not to. They don't want to give themselves up. They know how not to do that more, perhaps, or are more self-conscious. So I mean, there are many causes of gender-based violence, but I mean, there weren't too many cultural differences. I don't think there is culturalism is the explanation.
Thank you very much for fantastic and enlightening talk. I think we are right on time. Again, please accept our thanks and our heartfelt condolences for the country, and wish the best. And thank you everyone for participating in this gloomy day in Oklahoma or wherever you were. And we'll make the video available online. So in case you'd like to share or watch it, feel free to do so. And bye-bye.
Bye-bye.